We call it World War One now, but
Right. Yeah.
back then it was simply the Great War,
Yeah.
a title that feels kind of almost naive in retrospect. Like they had no idea it was just the first act
Right.
in a much bigger, much more devastating global drama.
Yeah.
And that's what we're diving into today. So,
Okay.
how a war that ended in 1918
Right.
continues to shape the world we live in.
It's really a fascinating case study in how historical events
Yeah.
aren't isolated incidents.
Yeah.
And that's especially true in the 20th century,
Right.
where the line between World War I and World War II
Yeah.
gets very blurry.
Yeah.
They're practically two chapters in the same kind of tragic story.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And to understand that story, we're looking at a really interesting
Okay.
mix of sources today.
Right.
Some excerpts from a Spanish text analyzing the geopolitical landscape,
Okay.
a collection of New York Times articles from the war's centennial,
Okay.
and even a thought-provoking YouTube analysis.
That connects the dots to today.
Wow, that's
Yeah,
quite the mix.
it is. It's interesting.
It is. So before we get into the trenches and the telegrams,
Right.
let's set the stage.
Okay.
It's the early 1900s.
Okay.
And Europe is like this overstuffed, overconfident dinner party,
Right.
just teetering on the edge of chaos.
Yeah.
Our Spanish text really emphasizes this idea of Europe as a powder keg.
Which makes sense when you realize the term powder keg comes from this era.
Right.
You see, back then,
Yeah.
everyone imagined a future
Yeah.
dominated by powerful empires.
Right.
But instead of competing through trade or diplomacy,
Mm-hmm.
they were stuck in this high-stakes game of risk,
Oh.
hoarding resources, carving up territory, and forming alliances
Right.
that were more like pre-written declarations of war.
And nowhere is that more apparent
Right.
than in the scramble for Africa.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine, just for a moment, European powers sitting around a table in Berlin, literally dividing an entire continent
Wow.
amongst themselves, as if the people living there were just furniture.
It's a shocking display of imperial arrogance.
Yeah.
And it's crucial for understanding why resentment was brewing,
Yeah.
especially for a newly unified Germany that felt it had missed out on the colonial land grab.
Oh.
You can see how this fueled a dangerous sense of entitlement and, frankly, desperation.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you've got this backdrop of simmering tensions.
Right.
But then you throw the Balkans into the mix.
Oh, boy.
The New York Times articles
Yeah.
describe this region as a tinderbox.
Right.
And just like a tinderbox,
Okay.
all it took was a single spark.
And that spark, of course, was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
Which, as we all know,
Right.
set off this chain reaction that
Yeah.
nobody could have predicted, alliances that were supposed to deter conflict,
Right.
ended up accelerating it like a runaway train, full of explosives.
The Spanish text uses the analogy
Okay.
of a fishing net.
Okay.
Everyone tangled up and dragged down together.
Oh,
It's a haunting image and tragically accurate.
it is.
No one marched into World War I expecting a global conflict.
Right.
But these alliances created a scenario where it was practically inevitable.
Wow. And then as if this tangled web of alliances wasn't enough,
Right.
technology enters the scene
Yeah.
and really changes the whole game.
Yeah,
We're talking about a level of mechanized warfare that the
Yeah.
world had never even imagined. Right?
exactly. It's
Yeah.
it's a tragic irony. The
Yeah.
Industrial Revolution, which had brought so much progress,
Right.
also gave rise to weapons
Yeah.
capable of unimaginable destruction.
Right.
Machine guns that could mow down
Yeah.
entire battalions,
Yeah.
tanks that could roll over trenches, and then
Right. And that
poison gas.
the use of chemical weapons,
Right.
especially by Germany
Right.
in those early days,
Yeah.
feels like a turning point. You know, it's
Yeah.
like
No.
all bets are off.
Yeah.
The rules of warfare, whatever they were, just shattered.
Absolutely. And you see the consequences of this new kind of warfare
Yeah.
reflected in the New York Times articles.
Right.
The accounts from
Yeah.
the trenches are just
Brutal.
heartbreaking.
Yeah.
The sheer scale of the suffering,
Yeah.
the constant fear,
Right.
the descriptions of trench foot.
Oh, God.
It's almost impossible to comprehend.
Reading those accounts,
Yeah,
I was really struck by how young
I know.
some of the soldiers were.
I know.
Many of them were barely old enough to vote,
Right.
yet there they were,
Yeah.
trapped in these muddy hellscapes.
Yeah.
What about you? Was
Oh.
there a particular detail that stood out to you?
Honestly, it's the
Yeah.
sense of disillusionment that resonates.
Right.
These soldiers went off expecting heroism,
Right.
adventure, a quick victory. Instead, they found themselves bogged down
Yeah.
in a war of attrition,
Right.
where survival often came down to sheer luck.
Wow.
That dissonance between expectation and reality
Yeah.
is palpable in those articles.
And it wasn't just confined to Europe either.
Right,
This war, which began as a very European conflict,
right.
quickly
Yeah.
became a global crisis.
The domino effect is truly terrifying.
Yeah.
The Ottoman Empire joined the fray,
Yeah.
then Japan, and eventually the United States was drawn in as well.
Right.
Suddenly you have this truly global conflict,
Yeah.
with battlefields spanning from the Western Front to the Middle East to the high seas.
It makes you think about the interconnectedness of our world, even back then.
Right.
How quickly a regional conflict can
Yeah.
spiral into something far larger and more devastating.
Precisely. And that's a lesson that feels incredibly relevant today, wouldn't you say?
It does.
It's a stark reminder that peace,
Right.
however fragile, requires constant vigilance
Yeah.
and a commitment to understanding the ripple effects of our actions.
Speaking of ripple effects,
Right.
by the time the armistice was signed in 1918,
Yeah.
the world had been irrevocably changed.
Yes.
We're not just talking about shifting borders,
Right.
but the collapse of entire empires.
Wow.
The
Okay.
Austro-Hungarian Empire, the
Right.
Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire. Gone.
It's hard to overstate the seismic shift this represented.
I know.
Imagine the geopolitical landscape redrawn,
Yeah.
the old order crumbling, new ideologies struggling to fill the void.
And that's where the story of World War I gets really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's not just about the fighting,
Wow.
but about the world that emerged from the ashes.
Exactly.
It's almost like the world had been through this massive trauma, you know?
Right.
And like any trauma, it left scars.
Absolutely.
I mean, the New York Times article about the Balkans
Right.
really drives this point home decades later.
Right.
The region was still grappling with the fallout
Yeah.
of those unresolved tensions, of those old wounds that
That never
never
really-
quite healed.
The war's legacy is visible in how modern Balkan nations still grapple with ethnic tensions,
Right.
inflamed by the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Right.
It's a stark reminder
Yeah.
that you can't just redraw borders on a map
Right.
and expect centuries of history and conflict to just vanish overnight.
Exactly. And it wasn't just political borders that were redrawn.
Right.
The entire ideological landscape shifted
Yeah.
out of the ashes of this war.
Right.
You see the rise of communism in Russia,
Right.
fascism in Italy and Germany,
Right.
all fueled by disillusionment,
Yeah.
economic instability, and this yearning for something different.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
The war to end all wars, they called it.
Right.
But it actually planted the seeds for even greater conflict.
Right.
That interwar period
Yeah.
wasn't just a pause, it was a pressure cooker, where these radical ideologies could fester and gain traction.
The Spanish text makes a really interesting point
Okay.
about the Treaty of Versailles.
Right.
It argues that the treaty, meant to ensure lasting peace,
Right.
actually laid the groundwork for future conflict
Right.
by imposing such harsh penalties on Germany.
Right.
By blaming them for the whole war.
Yeah.
It created this breeding ground for resentment and extremism.
It's a classic case of unintended consequences.
Right.
The Allies, understandably, wanted to punish Germany and
Right.
prevent another war.
Right.
But in doing so, they created a climate of humiliation and economic hardship
Right.
that made extremism appealing to many.
And then, as if the war and its aftermath weren't enough,
Right.
you have the Spanish flu pandemic
Oh, gosh. So
sweeping across the globe.
imagine the devastating.
Pretty dark.
Millions dead.
Right.
Not on battlefields, but in homes and hospitals.
Right.
The war, by displacing populations
Right.
and disrupting healthcare systems,
Yeah.
created the perfect conditions for a pandemic to thrive.
Yeah.
It's yet another layer of tragedy stemming from this conflict.
It's like this one event,
Yeah,
World War I, sent shockwaves through the entire 20th century.
you did.
It's like the YouTuber we mentioned earlier argued,
Right.
World War I and World War II are practically two acts in the same play.
Yeah.
Both fueled by this toxic mix of nationalism, imperialism,
Right.
and the failure to truly address the root causes of the first conflict.
And that's what makes studying this period so incredibly relevant today.
It is.
It's a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
A reminder that those same forces,
Right.
nationalism, the struggle for resources, the rapid pace of technological change,
Right.
they're all still in play today.
So where do we go from here? What lessons from this tumultuous era can we apply to navigating the even more complex world of the 21st century?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It
If
is.
there's one key takeaway from all of this,
Yeah.
it's that history doesn't repeat itself,
Right?
but it often rhymes.
Right.
Same patterns, the same dangerous ideologies,
Right.
they have a way of resurfacing.
It's almost like we have a responsibility,
Yeah.
not just to learn from the past, but to really wrestle with it,
Yeah.
to understand how the choices made back then
Right.
continue to shape the world we live in today.
Exactly. And that's why I appreciate these deep dives so much.
Me too.
They're not just about recounting facts and figures.
Right.
They're about grappling with complexity, with nuance.
Right.
And that's how we learn, how we grow,
Right.
how we hopefully make better choices in the present.
It's clear we've only just scratched the surface today.
Yeah.
There are countless stories within these sources, stories of bravery, of loss, of resilience,
Absolutely.
stories that can teach us so much if we're willing to listen.
True.
So we encourage you to explore them, to delve into those personal accounts, those historical analyses,
Yes.
and discover your own insights into this pivotal period in history.
Because the more we understand where we've been,
Uh-huh.
the better equipped we are to navigate where we're going.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through history, and don't forget to check out the show notes for links to all the fascinating sources we discussed today.